had no canonical narrative to depend on for guidance. Instead, we had a breach of constancy in our lives, which made it difficult to figure out what it might mean to act with virtue and integrity within the boundaries of separation and disruption. Immersed in uncertainty, we had no traditions or past lived experience on which we could base our desire to act wisely. Separated from people we love, fearful that our days could be numbered, unable to depend on a government that had failed to warn us of what was coming, we were left to face each day without knowledge of what were the better and what were the worst ways of living through a life-threatening pandemic. We were immersed in a tragic situation in which whatever we chose to do might leave undone what we should have done.
Today, we share with you a few stories that show us engaging in the here and now of COVID life, adapting to the contingencies of daily living, and also plunging into actions that assume a shared future. The first story is called Grocery Shopping.
10 days into the lockdown, I tell Carolyn, I've got to get to the grocery store. We're running out of milk, bread, dog food, and paper products.
I saw on the news that Publix is restricting morning hours to senior shoppers.
Good. I'm going to drive to Pasco County tomorrow, where it will be safer to shop.
But that's a 25-mile drive.
That's okay. They've had very few cases and no deaths yet.
Well, while you're there, would you stop at the bagel shop? We haven't had bagels in forever.
Next day, I rise untypically early, put on compression stockings, long pants, and a sweatshirt with a hood, grab 2 masks and a handful of disposable rubber gloves.
You look like an alien from outer space, I tell Art as he departs. I can feel his anxiety, though I say nothing about it.
I take some deep breaths when I enter my car. I haven't told Carolyn how treacherous this feels. The grocery store represents a line I'm crossing from the cocoon safety of our home into a zone where virus lurks in every nook and cranny. Some things are better left unsaid. As I drive, I reflect on the insecurity I've been feeling. The pandemic brings to our attention how close we live to the edge of extinction. The pandemic also challenges us to live an autoethnographic life, to accept and deal with what we have now, which is a moment saturated with not knowing. Our plans for the future either have been obliterated or put on hold. We don't know when or whether this pandemic ever will end. Thus, the pandemic offers us something missing from our lives, an awakening to the reality of the given moment. COVID also brings us an adventure we never anticipated. Like any real adventure, the not knowing part can evoke fear and panic. It dares us to lean into a situation that instinctively we desire to back away from because it is so uncertain. Though humans live by habits, we also live for excitement. Of course, the menacing quality of this pandemic is not the kind of excitement I normally seek in an adventure, but adventures are the stuff that life stories are made of because they test our character and can reveal new aspects of ourselves to ourselves. At age 75, I'm in the category of the COVID endangered. Doctors tell me my health is good, but age 75 is age 75. And the fragility of my own lived experience is not something from which I can easily shield myself. Can I grow comfortable with this uncertainty? Can I accept the stress and still find pleasure living in the shadow of pandemic? Where did you get those gloves? I'd love to have a pair, the woman waiting on me in the bagel store says. I can't believe how many people's hands I touch every day. On Amazon, I tell her, I slip my credit card into the slot, careful not to touch the machine. I wave away the pen she extends and sign the slip with mine. When I reach the car, I disinfect the bags and place them on a bed sheet in the back of my SUV. I turn my gloves inside out to remove them and toss them on the floor. Finally, I wash my hands with Perel sanitizer. When I reach the public supermarket, I adjust my mask and put on a new pair of gloves. Entering the store, I take a shopping cart that has just been disinfected. Every patron in the store appears to be a senior, but quite a few aren't wearing masks here in rural Trump country. I make my way methodically down the aisles, maintaining a safe space from other patrons. I'm shocked to find toilet paper shelves empty and a sign above the few off-brand paper towels that says, "One to a customer, please." In the frozen food aisle, customers are indiscriminately overfilling their carts with TV dinners and frozen pizzas. I hear one patron ask another if she feels she is hoarding supplies and food. "I am not hoarding," comes the response. "I am stockpiling." I also deviate from my shopping list, grabbing frozen food we have never eaten before, just in case. At the checkout counter, I turn many of the UPS codes face up so the clerk can process my purchases without touching them. When I get to my car, I spray disinfectant on the items, take off my gloves and mask, and drive away. Arriving home, I set all the packages on the kitchen counter, which Carolyn has already disinfected, and she takes over from there. Careful not to touch Carolyn, I undress in the kitchen and head immediately for the shower.
Growing old together. I never thought the four of us would all get old at the same time, I say to Art, watching Zen, our 10-year-old Aussie, fall as she rounds the corner into our kitchen, gets up, then walks into the wall. I glance toward the dining room at Buddha, our deaf 16-year-old rat terrier. She refused her food and pills this morning and has been sacked out on the doggy bed all day. Awake now, it takes minutes for her to get her arthritic body out of the bed into a standing position. Then she stares into space as though she can't remember what she got up for. "Do you have to pee?" I ask, hand signaling toward the doggy door. What kind of life is this for them? Yesterday, Buddha stood at her water bowl like she wanted a drink, but her head wobbled back and forth as though she couldn't control it. And Zen is getting worse every day, falling more often and walking in circles. The neurologist said she would go downhill rapidly as the brain tumor spreads. Look how her head is caved in. The nerves no longer stimulate the muscles, and one side of her head is the shape of a bashed-in skull.
I know, but it's not time yet.
But both of their worlds have narrowed so much. Zen doesn't even go up the stairs anymore after she tumbled down them. How will we know when it is time?
I'm not sure, but as long as Zen can do her nightly sprints outside and chase the ball, I'm not ready.
Even if she can't pick up the ball in her mouth anymore and her back legs collapse when she turns or stops?
As long as she can still take the walk around the block, I won't want to let her go.
I feel the same way about Buddha. I want to keep her with us as long as she still gets excited on her to take her nightly walks, even if I do have to carry her most of the way. Buddha has slept curled up with me every night for 16 years.
And Zen has kissed and cuddled me for 10.
Are we holding on to them for them or us?
Oh, that's the important question, isn't it?
I just can't imagine losing both of them at the same time.
I don't want to think about that right now.
Me either, but I can't think about anything else. 2 weeks later, when Zen develops new breathing problems, we call a hospice vet to come to our home to euthanize our Zenny. Before the doctor arrives, Art takes her out front for one last full speed run in our yard. She smiles at the end, even as she collapses. We walk her around the block one final time, tears streaming down both our faces. We gently place her on a towel on her favorite purple lounge chair. kiss and cuddle her, feeding her big spoons of vanilla ice cream as the needle goes in. For the next few weeks, our rat terrier Buddha grows increasingly unstable. She throws up and we have to take her to the vet several times to be hydrated since she won't eat or drink. We both are numb. First Zen, then Buddha, who now seems to be depressed and grieving for Zen. It was easy during this time of grief to ignore the pandemic.
A little puppy love. On March 7th, 2020, 2 weeks after Zen died, we decided to take a drive only to look at rat terrier puppies.
We aren't going to buy one.
It isn't fair to Buddha.
I just want to feel a little puppy joy. Unbeknownst to Art, I had put a water bowl, a leash, and some food in a bag in the back seat.
Unbeknownst to Carolyn, I had already chosen a name.
I can't imagine living without a dog. A puppy would be good for us. It might help us to be less COVID-centered.
But what about Buddha?
Well, maybe a puppy would be good for Buddha too.
Honey, we'll be 85 and 90 when the puppy is 15.
I don't want to think about that now. When we get out of the car at the breeder's home, dozens of adult rat terriers run under our feet. I can't stop smiling as we follow the handler 100 yards to her puppy pens. I haven't felt this joyful in months. I spy a tiny, energetic, tri-colored puppy. When I lift her up, she kisses my face nonstop. Then she settles into my arms as though this is where she belongs. I fall in love. She's 13 weeks, the woman says. Her mom wouldn't feed her baby, so we put this runt in with an older litter. They bullied her, so we kept her in a crate by herself and bottle fed her. She's a survivor. Art, I know we agreed we wanted a larger one and a brown one rather than another tricolor. When Art doesn't respond, I put the little puppy back into her pen. She's had such a rough start, I rationalized to myself. All the puppy books would advise not to pick this one. We proceed to the area with a litter of larger brown puppies. The brown puppies are delightful, but I feel nothing special when I pick them up one by one over and over. I can't tell one from the other, and mostly they want to jump out of my arms. Can we look at the little one again?
Sure.
My heart goes pitter-patter when I hold her. I hand the tiny bundle to Art, who seems to enjoy her face kisses.
We'll take her.
Really?
Really. This puppy chose us. We'll name her Mali, a Thai word for flower.
Breaking free.
I'm ready to start training Mali to walk on leash.
Do you think she's ready?
I don't think puppies are ever ready. They like nothing more than running free.
So you mean you're ready?
Yes, I am. And besides, sooner or later, she has to learn to walk on leash. We head out the door and allow the dogs to run free across our front lawn.
Look, Art, Buddha and Molly are play nipping each other, and now Buddha is running after her. I can't believe how energized Buddha seems.
We let the dogs play for a few minutes, then I drop her leather leash near her. She advances cautiously, first licking, then biting it. She sniffs it, circles, and then looks up at me, unsure what to do. I gently attach it to her collar and drop it by her side. After a few seconds, I slowly start walking down our street. Good girl, Mali, I say, handing her a treat as she heels by my side, matching my rhythm. Then suddenly she stops cold and won't move. In a few seconds, she starts on her own, now leading me forward. Meanwhile, Carolyn picks up Buddha and carries her as we turn up the next street. Mali continues intermittently starting, then stopping abruptly, as if we are doing a dance and she would rather lead than follow. As we approach the top of the street, one of our neighbors who is clearing debris on his lawn spots us. We move toward each other while keeping our distance. I note the sorrowful look on his face.
Are you okay, James?
Not really. My brother died yesterday. He had the COVID.
James speaks softly, a tenderness in his eyes. The three of us look at each other in stunned silence. We want to hug James, but we do not move. COVID is no longer an abstraction. For the first time, it has hit us close to home. In the past, we only shared small talk with this African-American neighbor, but now James feels like family.
My brother called 3 days ago from the hospital, said he had a fever and a cough. Then yesterday, the hospital, they called and said he passed away. It all happened so fast.
Oh, James, we're so sorry.
He was strong, energetic, a hearty man. I didn't think this could happen. Now he's not even going to get a proper funeral. On the walk back home, I think about the pain in James' eyes and how his suffering seemed to inspire him to reach out to us, then us to him. His deep, unexpected loss had awakened all our hearts. I also sense a drastic change that this disease is having on the meaning of the future. What does it mean now to be ambitious? We are all in one way or another living as exiles from the life we knew, from the direction we assumed we were moving in, and thus we have no real sense of the future. What plans can we make? What projects can we undertake when our first responsibility is to keep endless watch on ourselves? We can't relax for a moment lest we breathe on somebody or expose ourselves to their deadly virus. Is this really living? As I turn the corner and walk toward our house, I have an urge to run, something I haven't done very much of late. I let go of the leash and set Molly free, and we both dash up on our cul-de-sac. Freed from my grip, she heads instinctively for our front yard. There she runs in circles, shaking the leash in her mouth like a swimmer shaking out when surfacing, as she exerts control over the leash. Suddenly, Buddha turns into the yard, dancing around and chasing Molly, with Carolyn laughing and racing to catch up. We both note the smile on Buddha's face as she becomes the happy dog she has been most of her life. Basking in this momentary freedom, they remind us how tired we are of the COVID constraints.
Buddha miraculously lived for 14 more months. She slept all day, but still got up to be carried on her nightly walks. She snuggled between Art and me during the night and managed to go outside to take care of her bodily functions. When we later decided to move, all her safe places and routines disappeared, which made her disabilities more apparent. Often then she stood staring at the wall or paced the floor, seemingly unaware that we were present. Sometimes she was unable to stand and seemed uncomfortable even when lying down. 8 days after moving, we made the decision to once again bring in the hospice vet. Buddha's passing was loving and peaceful. Wearing our COVID masks this time, we lit candles and played music we had recorded for the moment, as we had for Zen. Art and I lay beside Buddha on our bed and relived old memories, telling her how much we loved her as she passed. Molly stayed close, sniffing her body after she died. When we were ready, the vet wrapped Buddha's body in a purple blanket and placed her in a little basket. "Would you like to carry her?" she asked us. We nodded and solemnly carried her to the doctor's SUV for her journey to the crematorium. It felt like a funeral procession. Molly retreated to the bedroom for the next few weeks, clearly grieving, and we had to coax her to eat. Buddha and Zen linked us to our pre-pandemic and pre-retirement life, and now their loss was part of the pandemic sense of discontinuity and vulnerability. Molly represented hope for the future. Neither of us ever considered giving up the joy of canine love to escape future pain. We were determined to live whatever life remained as fully as possible.
Adventure seekers.
That we could even think of moving into a new home in the middle of a pandemic is testimony to our resilience, need for adventure, and sheer craziness. In November 2020, we went looking for homes for sale. Just looking, we said once again. That is, until we fell in love with a large home in the small town of Safety Harbor, Florida. We adored the home that we had lived in for 29 years near our university. But our neighborhood had deteriorated. The homes on either side of us were not well maintained. Another was abandoned, and yet another was occupied by an addicted crack cocaine dealer who made deliveries all hours of the night. We had lost our sense of community. In spite of the threat posed by COVID, we knew it was time for a change.
Oh my!
Our eyes say as they meet across the open kitchen and living room and focus on the spacious lanai, surrounded by lush tropical plants and a huge waterfall. In the backyard, majestic oak trees stand tall over swaying palms. 3 times larger than our current yard, this one feels like a park.
Wow.
A paradise with lots of country living space located in a small artsy town and only 20 minutes from downtown Tampa. This has it all.
We would take it if we could just purchase the downstairs.
Art jokes with the real estate agent looking up the stairs to the 2nd level and rubbing his arthritic hip. And if you too would do the yard work.
Carolyn jokes, of course, to the real estate agents who now are friends.
We can't do this, Art. We're supposed to be downsizing, and we agreed to no steps.
I know. But the next week we return. We can't get this house out of our minds.
I guess we've failed downsizing 101. Art chuckles as we share fantasies of what it will be like to live in a community and neighborhood we will feel a part of.
We can walk to the outdoor restaurants.
And take the dogs. Did you see all the dogs at the outdoor cafes?
And we can walk beside the bay.
And in the tree-lined parks and on hiking trails.
Hopefully get involved in the community. But it's not just the push from our neighborhood and the pull of the joy we may be able to experience in this one. We aren't getting any younger. If we don't do this now, we probably won't ever do it.
I agree. This will be a wonderful place to grow older. We can make new friends, have something to look forward to.
That's the best reason. I'm weary of having my mind constantly clouded by COVID.
I like that. The best of both worlds, living now and assuming a life after COVID.
There will be challenges like finding new doctors and doing all that yard work.
Oh, I love the sense of shared adventure, especially after 8 months of not knowing what the future would bring or if there would even be one.
We need to break free from COVID's control over our lives.
But while still staying safe.
Let's go for it. Cancer in the time of COVID.
November 2020, my brother-in-law, Ron, calls from Mississippi to tell me that Judy, my 72-year-old sister, has been diagnosed with cancer, kidney cancer. She is having her left kidney and the vein to the heart removed in a hospital at Tulane University. Because COVID-19 is rampant, I am reluctant to get on the plane to be with her. Her daughter, Ginger, and son, Blaine, test negative for COVID, and they do go. Because she needs to have the surgery with a specialist in New Orleans across state lines, her insurance will not pay. An hour before the surgery is scheduled, the hospital cancels. We are in COVID, they say is the explanation. We wonder how much the scheduling issues are affected by her status as a special needs patient. It's God's plan, my sister says. There was a reason I was not supposed to have surgery today. I am amazed at her faith and positive attitude. I tell her I will pray for her. Her son has to return to Panama where he lives and cannot wait for the rescheduled surgery. The rest of the family, including my sister, trekked back to their home in Mississippi. Art.
What's the matter?
My nephew has COVID and they won't let him back into Panama. That means my sister also could have COVID. If so, she won't be able to reschedule her surgery now, which means she might die.
Slow down, slow down. How do you know all this?
My brother-in-law called, sobbing on the phone.
Let's start with your sister. She tested negative in the hospital, right?
Yes, several times.
And the whole family wore masks, right?
Well, yeah, in the hospital, but I'm not sure they always wore them outside the hospital.
And weren't your niece and nephew tested before they arrived at the hospital?
Yes, and my nephew was tested in Panama before he left the country.
Didn't he get tested again when he left New Orleans?
No, and I'm not sure why, but then he had a quick test when he landed in Panama, which was positive.
Well, those quick tests aren't very accurate. Lots of false positives.
I know that, but they put him and others who tested positive in a bus that wasn't air conditioned, and he sat at the airport for hours. Then they took him to a hotel. He said it was awful. No AC, no electricity, nothing to eat. He felt like a prisoner. And they took away his cell phone. Art, I just talked to my niece again.
And?
She said Blaine somehow got his cell phone back and called a friend who was a lawyer. He brought a medical technician to the hotel with a COVID test kit. That test was negative, so they let him go.
Phew, what a relief. So when will the surgery be rescheduled?
They don't know yet. But in the meantime, my sister's vaginal bleeding is worse, like a hemorrhage, her husband says. 2 weeks later, my sister has surgery. It is a success, but for months, she cannot stand up without feeling dizzy. She cannot go back to the doctors in New Orleans because her insurance won't pay. So the myriad doctors in Mississippi she sees try to figure out what is wrong. When she loses her voice, they tell her it is coming from her thyroid. One doctor says she needs to have her thyroid taken out, but another feels she is too weak for the operation. She declines the surgery, and by May, she feels better. In June, as we are writing this talk, she trips and falls, breaking the ball in her shoulder. You have to get better by September, I say to her, so you can visit us in North Carolina, and then we can go to visit family in Virginia as we planned. We haven't all been together for several years. Who knows how long our brother will recognize us, given his dementia. I will, she says, by the grace of God. Her life feels so precarious to me, and I continue to be amazed at her optimistic outlook. If not for COVID and the low vaccination rate in conservative Mississippi, I would be there helping out. Closing.
I've written 3 different drafts of the conclusion to our talk, but I'm not satisfied with any of them.
I'm not surprised. It's not as if the pandemic has vanished, though many people talk as if it's in the rearview mirror.
That sounds like some of Trump's magical thinking. It's like a miracle. One day it'll just disappear. But there was no miracle. Our government failed us when we needed them most. Every public health expert in the world knows that you have to have early detection and early response for any hope of dealing effectively with a pandemic. But governments around the world lack the imagination and insight to draw the correct conclusions swiftly. It was a colossal example of lethargy, ignorance, and denial. They gave an efficient, wicked virus a 60-day head start.
Sad and true, but let's not use the conclusion to go off on a political rant.
I agree. I'm not going to do that. I want to focus on what we learned about living through a pandemic so far and how our stories may evoke other people's stories. Have we gained any knowledge or wisdom? What sticks out in your mind? What do you remember?
I remember how the two of us were snuggled in bed with Zen and Buddha, when we heard the news about the first confirmed case of COVID in the US.
Do you recall how you felt?
I don't think it really registered for us. At this point, it didn't feel like anything out of the ordinary. I certainly didn't expect we would soon be living in such a frightening new reality.
That's how I remember it as well. Maybe a few weeks later, I felt it might turn into something akin to a temporary hassle, but nothing on the order of the home confinement and economic shutdown that was coming.
Why were we so inattentive? What did we miss?
I don't think it was a question of missing something. More likely, it was a case of repressing the threat it posed to our existence. When it comes to mortality, we live in a perpetual state of denial. The thought of a global pandemic killing millions of people indiscriminately was just too horrific to acknowledge consciously.
That was the point at which we were forced to adapt to a level of uncertainty beyond anything we had ever experienced. At first, it seemed like a bad dream, bewildering and disorienting. Later, we felt terrified that COVID could last indefinitely and fearful that our age made us exceptionally vulnerable. I remember one evening early on, you had been rereading Camus' The Plague. We had a few drinks, shared some hugs and kisses, and we began talking through what was happening to us. Until then, we had been largely silent, numbed by the shock of it all.
I remember that night. I couldn't get Camus' book out of my mind. How accurately he had described the denial, the squandering of opportunities to take timely precautions, and the sorrow that arises as the dead are carried off, the sick are confined, and the intellectuals debate how to explain what happened.
That was when I realized the extent to which COVID was clouding our minds. We had to resist the despair and resignation, the signs of which were all around us.
Camus made it clear that a plague brings moral choices with it. Toward the end of the novel, Dr. Roux, the narrator, is asked, "What does it mean, the plague?" "It's life. That's all," he says.
I take that to mean you don't have to give in to the virus. You don't have to bury your head in the sand and stop living. The virus humbled us. It reminded that none are granted immunity from mortality.
And the virus shows no mercy. It mutates, it varies, it encircles, it hides. There is no escape. It circulates through your subjectivity and alters your consciousness. In this sense, nobody is really COVID-free. You can only decide, perhaps you must decide, how to live in it, with it, alongside it, which is a constant struggle in the face of the lethal shadow it casts.
Thankfully, we had each other. You know, we really had it easier than most, given our resources, the absence of a job with demands, and 2 homes to go back and forth between. It's been hard for me to imagine how people living alone managed, like many of our friends did, without hugs and kisses and face-to-face interaction.
Or how others who lived in the forefront of the pandemic, rubbing shoulders with death, were able to act so heroically. The ER doctors and nurses treating patients in ICUs, working long, exhausting shifts with repeated exposures to people deathly ill with the virus, many of them called upon to take on more and more, too often even without protective gear.
And then having to stand in for family when death arrived. These are more than acts of duty. They are acts of love.
I'm glad you brought up love. There's so much anger and meanness across the world today. I think it stems, at least in part, from a kind of heartlessness, born of an overemphasis on power and politics, an absorption with being absolutely certain you are right, and on winning arguments. Usually autoethnography moves in a different direction because it is a genre of doubt.
That reminds me of another thing I recall about that night when we got into the nitty-gritty of how we wanted to live through the pandemic. The realization that we wanted to act from an awakened heart, something we spoke about years ago in Heartful Autoethnography. To resist the psychological and spiritual despondency provoked by the pandemic, we were going to have to become comfortable with uncertainty and attentive to what Pema Chodron calls the open quality of any given moment.
We don't always achieve it, but what we strive for is presence, simply being present. What I learned from my students all those years of teaching courses on love was how everyone needs someone to be there for them, simply to be there, to be present. Near the height of the plague, Dr. Rue meditates on what keeps people going, the source of their dogged will to live when they could just as easily drift into death. A loveless world is a dead world, he warns. And always there comes an hour when one is weary of confinement, of one's work, and of devotion to duty, and all one craves for is a loved face, the warmth and wonder of a loving heart. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow. Please unmute your microphones as you show your applause for Art and Caroline. Yes, please leave comments in the chat box as well. And if you want to use any of the other reactions, please use that. It's always lovely to see. Well, wonderful keynotes, everybody.